Today we are modeling an eye. As you can see, I've added a thin layer of wax to the orbital bone and smoothed that out nicely. I've also added an indentation which is called the naso-orbital fossa, and that's a natural marking scene, so I added that first. So I'm ready to create the eye, and I've used a piece of wax. You can tell it's round, it's slightly larger than a marble. So I'm going to put that in the bony orbit. And I think that's a good size. You don't obviously want it too big or too small. You certainly don't want it to protrude when you're done forming the eye. So what I'm going to do to start is I'm just going to take my thumb along the edge, and I'm going to blend the wax about 360 degrees all the way around the bony orbit. And then I'm going to smooth the rough areas with pressure and the heat of my fingers as I do this. So I'm just going to continue to smooth into place. Now, keeping in mind that as I'm smoothing, I want the lid to be oblong because that's what the eye is. So you notice that I'm not putting pressure on the eye here because I don't want this flat, and I'm smoothing it out to the side in an oblong manner. Our objective is the appearance of an eyeball with two thin lids present. So I'm just going to continue to smooth this wax around and around, and as you can see, the heat of my finger is causing that to smooth nicely. It's taken me about 10 minutes to smooth that marble of wax into the bony orbit, and just using my fingers and the heat of my hand has smoothed that in quite nicely. Sometimes in these cracks and crevices, I'll take our green brush and dip it in hot water and smooth that together as well. So now what I want to make sure is that it does not protrude beyond the anterior plane of the orbit. It would appear swollen, and that's not what we're looking for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a spatula, and I'm going to turn the mannequin on profile, and I'm going to lay the spatula on the frontal bone and also on the zygomatic. And I just want that blade to barely touch the bulb of the eye or be slightly below. So if it's protruding or sticking out, I know I have to smooth that down a little bit more. But if the ball of the eye is just touching the blade or slightly below, which it is, then I'm comfortable with the anterior projection. Okay, so once again, we're going to check to make sure on profile also that there is roundness and the normal convexity is seen, and it is. So we are ready to start with our canthuses. Now with our canthi, we want to keep in mind we're going to be doing the medial canthus and the lateral canthus. So the lateral canthus is what I want to start with first. And the lateral canthus is found halfway on the bony orbit medially. So I'm going to go about halfway down on this bony orbit, and I'm going to make a little mark to know that that's going to be my lateral canthus. Then we're going to place the medial canthus. Now the medial canthus is higher than the lateral canthus. Keeping in mind also when we place the medial canthus is there is an eye width between each eye. So if my lateral canthus is here, I'm going to come up slightly to make that medial canthus. So the medial canthus is higher, the lateral canthus is lower. Then I'm going to make the line of closure, and that's going to be a gentle arc in the lower 2/3 of the orbit. So what I do typically with my finger is just start to remove some of this wax. And notice how I'm doing that in an arc. And I'm going to smooth this away. because when a person is deceased, their upper lid dominates over the lower lid. So you can't even see the lower lid. The lower lid recedes. I'm just going to use again the heat of my finger to smooth that out. So I have my medial canthus, I have my lateral canthus, and I have my line of closure. Now I told you before we had that indentation or that fossa for the nasal orbital fossa, and that's kind of disappeared a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and reestablish that. That's a natural marking. And I'm just going to continue to smooth this in. And then I'm going to use a toothpick just to make some crow's feet or some sulci on the orbit. And if you get those a little bit too deep, you can just smooth those out with your finger to soften those up. I'm now ready to add the last two features of the eye. And the first one I want to add is the palpebral fold. So I'm going to take a little piece of wax just like this. It's nice and thin, it's elongated, and I'm going to lay it across the upper lid. And then again, you're just using the heat of my hand, I'm going to smooth it in. Except I'm going to leave the sulcus visible. And you want to keep this pretty thin because remember, we're trying to make sure that the projection of this eye is correct and we don't want it to appear swollen. So I just use a very thin piece of wax to lay across the bulb, and just by using my finger I'm feathering that out, and the heat of my hand is kind of melting that in to the upper lid. Once again, posteriorly I want to smooth that line out, but I want to keep this sulcus for the appearance of that fold. Notice a lot of the time I'm not using instruments. I find it easier to use my hands when I'm sculpting. Sometimes if I have trouble getting into corners, that's when I'll use a tool or a brush and some warm water to help me smooth that out. But for the most part, I use my hands when I'm sculpting. Okay, and then the last feature we're going to use, or that I'm going to demonstrate for you, I'm going to use an elongated pledgelet of wax, and this is to get the effect of the oblique palpebral sulcus and the infraorbital pouch. So again, this is nice and thin. I definitely want to see a swelling for the infraorbital pouch, but I don't want to make it too thick. And so I'm going to place that right underneath the eye, just like so. And anything we do place, we're going to keep within the bony orbit. So I don't want to go too low close to the zygomatic. I want to keep this pledgelet of wax tucked up underneath the eye. And once again, just going to take my finger and smooth it in. But we want to see the swelling. We want to leave the sulcus. And just smooth and pat and feather. And as you can see, I'm not flattening this out, I'm leaving that swelling underneath the eye. Sometimes in the deceased you'll see very prominent infraorbital pouches. So you want to make sure that you're recreating that to match that person's natural markings and natural look. I'm going to take my brush. I have a little green handled brush here, and I'm just going to smooth that out a little bit where I can't reach. Okay, so just to go over some of the structures we have the naso-orbital fossa. I have the optic sulci, or otherwise known as crow's feet. I have the palpebral fold and sulcus. And I also have the oblique palpebral sulcus and the infraorbital pouch. And once again, I'm going to turn on profile and see that I need to smooth that out a little bit more. You can never smooth too much in this class. I can see that it's slightly swollen, so I'm just going to continue to smooth this down, that palpebral fold, because I want to make sure my anterior projection is correct.